Hello and welcome. I'm Tracy Brown, Director of Sense About Science. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the opening of Evidence Week in Parliament, which is organised by Sense About Science with the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, the House of Commons and House of Lords Libraries, and this year University of Nottingham is leading the charge with many other universities and research institutions around the country. I'm joined here on the Zoom link by MPs and peers who stand ready to answer questions from around the UK and by a group of specialists to assist, including the National Statistician, the Director General for Statistics Regulation, What Works National Advisor, the head of the UK's academic research funder UKRI, and the librarians from the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and also the Met Office. Welcome to everyone following us on the live stream on YouTube and other platforms too. Evidence Week in Parliament is a week in which MPs and peers receive speed briefings about research, emerging research from around the country on subjects such as how can the UK produce enough hydrogen, what real-time economic data is available, the discovery that muscle resilience is the key to healthy aging, how to spot deepfakes, and the safety of ammonia as a shipping fuel, to name just a few of what the briefings which will happen over the next few days. Now, Parliament has the role of scrutinising decisions and policies, both formally in passing legislation and running inquiries into subjects that affect policies, but also questioning government ministers and officials. And it's an early warning system too of the way that policies are affecting lives, businesses and the environment as they are put into practice. People in all walks of life care that parliamentarians, MPs and peers do this well, and they want policies to work, to make sense, to be based on the best available knowledge, to be measurable and accountable. That is why it's people from all over the UK who are opening Evidence Week with their questions tonight, and we're joined by many of them too on the Zoom, so welcome to you. We're going to get through as many as possible with short responses from MPs and others helping them. Before I turn to the very first question, a quick word of welcome from Carol Monaghan, who is an MP who is sitting on what's now known as the Science, Innovation and Technology Committee. And I should say Carol has a lot of experience of being on the predecessor committee, SciTech, during some of the most challenging times where Parliament has had to question government, including particularly during the pandemic. Carol.
Thanks very much, Tracy. And I'm actually speaking just now from an airport lounge, so apologies for the sound quality if there's any issues. But can I say, first of all, thanks very much for the invite to join the panel and be part of Evidence Week. I think it's really important that MPs do participate and do understand how evidence impacts the work that they do. So a bit about myself. First of all, I was first elected 8 years ago as Member of Parliament for Glasgow North West. Prior to that, I was a physics teacher, did that for 20 years. Now, as a scientist, we use evidence, we use data, and we draw conclusions from that. It doesn't always work quite the same in Parliament. So I'll maybe just give you some examples of how evidence is used and how evidence is used well and how evidence can be used, let's just say in a way that probably most scientists wouldn't consider good practice. So first of all, some of the things that one of the biggest sources of evidence for us is the House of Commons Library. Now, if I have a question about pretty much anything, I can go to the House of Commons Library and say, can you get me some data on this? Can you get me some information? Can you find out how this has worked or how this particular issue has been dealt with in the past? And I'll give you an example. Now, often we're speaking in debates, and it's important that we use information that we've got from various sources. It's a really quite a good way of talking about the cost of living. He asked for the price of Freddo bars, and he wanted the price of Freddo bars over the last 10 years, and we wanted that compared to the average salary in the UK, so that he could a comparative idea of how inflation was hitting households using something that people clearly understood and had a good handle on. So that was really useful. And yes, there was a funny side to that, but that kind of doing that kind of thing really helps people visualise and understand the points that MPs are doing. So the House of Commons Library were able to provide all that information for my colleague. Other evidence we might use is from evidence from constituents on specific issues. For example, they might talk to us about how immigration is impacting their workforce, how Brexit possibly, but how Brexit is causing, what the issues that Brexit is currently causing their business, be it as an employer, as a worker. They may get in touch with us about how the cost of living is impacting them. And all of these things are really important because it helps us then look to the government and press the government on these issues to try and get some information on them and try and influence policy. But one of the evidence is used is by select committees. And Tracy, you've already mentioned in Science and Technology Innovation. I always forget the innovation now. The Science, Innovation, Technology Committees. And when committees are looking to use inquiries that they might consider, they will look at what's current, where they think there are gaps in understanding, possibly by MPs or by government, and they can investigate this issue, expert witness, and from that draw up a report which is then presented to government for their comment. But we can also actually look at government policy and we can scrutinise what the government is doing and where we see things going well and where things possibly may need some more work. And one of the things that's quite current just now is e-cigarettes. And a few years ago, our committee looked at e-cigarettes, and there's probably quite a lot I could say about that, considered a few years ago. It's maybe something we need to come back to now. But I think the last thing I'll say, Tracy, I know we're short of time, is that it's important when select committees are doing an inquiry that anybody can give evidence to that committee. Yes, we might get expert witnesses in to actually speak to the committee in person, but anybody can provide written evidence to a committee. So if there is an inquiry that's going on and you have something that you feel you can provide evidence for, then please do get in touch with select committees. There are opportunities online to submit that. And I would just encourage as many people as possible to engage with Parliament in that process.
Thanks, Carol. And a good moment to kick off with our first question of the opening. And that comes from Ruth Ann Harper, who is a clinical psychologist in Cheam. Ruth, you unmute yourself.
Hi. Is government aware that a recent Public Health England funded systematic review of the Baby Friendly initiative currently implemented throughout the NHS failed to find any evidence that it improves health outcomes for women or babies?
Thank you. Very good question. Sharon Hodgson MP, are you able to respond to this?
Yes, I'm here. I wasn't aware. What was the name of the questioner? Sorry, I didn't write the name.
Ruth.
Hi, Ruth, it's Sharon. No, I wasn't aware that no evidence had been found about the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative. The origin of this piece of work is the Baby Friendly Initiative, the UNICEF programme that it's based upon, and it was launched by the WHO and UNICEF back in 1991 to improve breastfeeding rates, and it also gives recommendations not only around breastfeeding but other areas such as sleep training and safety and postnatal mental health and physical and health support with things like weaning and stuff like that. So I know it is more than just the breastfeeding, but from what you say that no evidence has been found by who, did you say, Ruth?
It was then Public Health England who commissioned a systematic review into the Baby Friendly initiative, and they didn't find any good evidence that it improves health outcomes in a context like the UK.
Right. So obviously Public Health England, a trusted source. So that I have to say, I'm surprised that, you know, they found no health benefits from that. I would be interested in looking further into that research. I'm sort of, I breastfed both of my children. And I, you know, I think if you can, it's a great thing to do. I know it isn't suitable for everyone for a whole host of reasons, but they are now 27 and 29, and I know sort of, you know, a lot of the reasons I breastfed them was, you know, to encourage, and hopefully that they would benefit from, you know, not having as many allergies, you know, things such as diabetes is supposedly less in breastfed children, obesity. You know, overweight myself, and I'm pleased to say my children aren't, but you don't know whether that, you know, does correlate back to the breastfeeding. But I do know for the, you know, the bonding with your baby and all of that, for me, it really, really worked.
Sharon, should we ask Ruth to send through that study, because I think it would be quite useful to have a look at and pick that up. But thank you very much. I think all those beliefs are things that many people expected to come out of that study, and so it is clearly something that would be useful to share with interested parliamentarians.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much indeed. We go now to our next question, who is Bana Shriki, who is an engineer from Bradford.
Hiya, my question is, how does the Parliament assess whether government policies are sufficient to meet its NHS net zero commitment? Tracy, you're on mute.
Thank you. NHS is committed to net zero on emissions. So Philip Dunn is with us, who's from Environmental Audit. Philip, is this one for you? Do we have Philip Dunn with us? No. Can we come back to that question if we don't have Philip on the, okay. Let's move, Bana, I'm going to get an answer to your question as soon as Philip rejoins us. He was here, and I know that he's keen to talk about net zero policies. We're going to move to Ian Greenwood, and I'll come straight back to you, Bana, as soon as we have an answer for you. Ian Greenwood is a father whose daughter was tragically killed in a road crash. Ian.
Thanks, Tracy. My question's about the disproportionate number of deaths of young people and their passengers on Britain's roads. Is Parliament able to predict the reduction in deaths and serious injuries of young drivers, their passengers and others from road crashes following the introduction of graduated driving licenses for either under 25s or under 20s in Britain?
Right, okay, I think it's a behavioural sciences question. David Halpin, are you able to help with this?
Yeah, I'll certainly have a go, thank you. By the way, I should say, of course, I used to be National Advisor on what works, but I'm still running the Behavioural Insights team, so just to clarify that point. Yeah, no, I think there's actually quite a good literature, which you may be, the questioner may know already. It's been studied for a long time. New Zealand was early to move on graduated licenses. A number of US states have done it, Canada, etc. They're all pretty encouraging, and I assume that was very much behind what led to some of the changes in law over here. Varying estimates, you know, from a few percent up to 20 to 40% by some studies. They seem to work particularly well around curfews, avoiding young people driving at night, and without much evidence of it displacing elsewhere. It sounds like you've obviously had a terrible tragedy yourself. One of the key issues is, you'll be aware, is also young people often driving together in a car seems a particularly high risk factor. So it's got quite a good evidence base historically. It's a very good example of something which is relatively easy to analyze as the law change comes in. And in principle, I think you can use those range estimates to see, does it work? The final thing is, one of the things we should think about these things is not just, does it work overall, but which aspects of it works? So there's much less evidence, for example, about whether provisional license, you know, putting the P, the green P, whatever there, what are the other aspects which help to make it effective, which would optimize it? But anyway, the upshot seems to be, the short answer should be yes, it's something which you could predict within a given range on the basis of what's happened in other countries, and it's pretty encouraging in that sense, although it will be not much comfort for those who've suffered a tragedy already, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. And I should say, for anyone else who's watching on the live stream and not au fait with different parts of government, so David's an expert in understanding whether interventions actually work and helping the government to design studies to find that out. And so Parliament can benefit from looking to David sometimes to find out what questions they should be asking when questioning government. Now, Ian, I know we've also got a comment from Fabian Hamilton, who's Leeds North East, and he's abroad at the moment on shadow ministerial duties, but he has sent a comment. So I'm just going to go to our desk that's handling comments in from MPs and ask them to share something of that comment with you.
Thanks, Tracy. Fabian Hamilton says there's an urgent need to stop the alarming rise in road traffic accidents, many of which result in this tragic loss of life. This type of scheme has already been introduced in many countries, and it's vital that proper scrutiny and examination of the introduction of this scheme in the UK takes place, particularly if it has an impact on the many losses of life that are lost on our roads each year. Ian Greenwood has tirelessly campaigned for many years to make roads in Leeds safer, and it is testament to his efforts that in the past year the local authority and police force have introduced innovative schemes aimed at reducing road traffic accidents, and there is a fuller response that we can send.
Thank you, Ian. We'll send that on to you, and kudos to you that your MP recognises so well your efforts. While we've got you on the desk there, Nita, can I also say we did have a response sent in from Banashricky's MP Naz Shah from Bradford West. Can you share something of that with us too?
Yeah, so just a little bit at the beginning, it says, as parliamentarians, we can assess whether the government policies on this area are sufficient by the scrutiny provided by the Health and Social Care Select Committee. We then have an array of different ways to hold the government to account on their policies, from writing to the ministers, submitting written parliamentary questions, oral parliamentary questions, and even utilising debates on healthcare related issues to raise these matters in Parliament with the government. Brilliant,
thank you. We'll keep that live as a question though, Bana, please stay with us, because as soon as we have an MP from the Environmental Audit Committee, we'll come straight back to it. I'm going now to Andrew Gilruth, who is the Regional Moorlands Group Chair. And I hope we have something from you regarding the definition of a wildfire.
Tracy, thank you. So my question is, when will Parliament produce a single national definition of what constitutes a wildfire, and can it lead cross-sector collaboration to reduce the risk posed by the increasing vegetation fuel layer that actually fuels them?
Right, a very tough question. I don't know, Albert Klein-Tank is with us from the Met Office. Albert, is this something you can respond to?
Thank you very much. I'm working at the Met Office in the Hadley Centre, so we are mostly responsible for climate change, but definitely fire weather and fire relevant weather, and how often we see this both in the UK and abroad is one of the topics we are studying. But I must say that I'm not on top of the definitions and how this is defined across government. So, but definitely something increasing fire weather because of global warming is something we are very careful studying.
Thank you very much. Again, if we have other environment audit and other MPs join us on the call in short time, I'm going to bring them back to this question, Andrew, because I'm sure you want some response from them too. We also actually do have something from your MP, John Glenn. Can we go to that? Do we have a John Glenn response?
Unfortunately not, no.
No, okay, fine, okay. Sorry, I thought we had one there. Abby Jones has a question from Berry.
Is Parliament reviewing the data on the effect of voter ID, especially given that some voters were sent home before being officially locked?
Okay, so is Parliament reviewing that data? Can I just bring in here the librarians? We've got Grant Hill-Cawthorne from the House of Commons, we've got Patrick Vollmer from the House of Lords, You're providing information for MPs on these questions, or is there something you can provide information to MPs about? You have dashboards, you have information about voter behaviour.
Yes, no, I'm happy to answer that. So I'm Grant Hill-Cawthorne. I'm Managing Director of Research and Information in the House of Commons and House of Commons Librarian. And thank you to Carol for the plug earlier for the House of Commons Library. And actually, if you look at commonslibrary.parliament.uk, we publish a huge amount of research in areas such as this. We do have one, if you want to Google voter ID Commons Library, we updated a paper just over a week ago on this. So the actual assessment of the impact of voter ID will be done by the Electoral Commission. So they are looking at how the impact of the rollout of voter ID has happened. They actually did publish some interim results just a few weeks ago, where they found actually that the awareness of voters to actually bring ID with them was high. So lots of people had actually heard about the public information campaign. There was 0.25% of voters that were ultimately couldn't vote because of the new ID requirements. So initially about 0.7% were initially turned away. So they turned up to polling stations without ID, but actually 2/3 of them went home and came back later that day and were able to vote. But just to put that in perspective, 0.25% of the voting population in the local elections is still about 14,000 people that ultimately didn't come back later that day to vote. There were also about 4% of people in polls that didn't vote and didn't try to vote, that said that they hadn't tried to vote because of the new requirement, because they didn't have any suitable ID. However, it's very early days. So the Commission has said that there are lots of holes in the data and it's still trying to collect a lot more. They're hoping to publish a more complete report in September. And the government is also looking at the impact of the new voter ID measures, and those reports should be out in November. But like I say, we've got a detailed briefing on this if you just want to Google voter ID Commons Library, and that will come up for you.
Thank you. So that's really important that you can actually get your hands on some of the information that's going to MPs and see for yourself. And many people say to us after Evidence Week, they're really shocked to find they have such massive libraries in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. But there's a huge amount of information that they need to share. Right. We're going back now, to a question from Stephen Havel, who owns a laundrette in Torquay. Stephen, are you ready?
I am ready, yes. As the owner of a laundrette business in Torquay, our gas prices have tripled, which will force us to register for VAT within the next 2 years. In fact, we have just submitted our application to register for VAT. Has Parliament assessed the impact that the VAT threshold freeze until 2026 will have on small businesses?
Thank you. Now, Debbie Abrahams is here, who is on the Work and Pensions Committee. Debbie, is this something you can respond to?
It's not something that I've got specific experience of. I have to say it's certainly not part of the scope of the Work and Pensions Select Committee. This will be more under the scope of the under the Business Committee that Darren Jones chairs. But I do have immense sympathy with you in terms of the plight that you are facing. I had a bakery and the owner of that bakery contacted me, just a small bakery, and he contacted me as a constituency MP and was asking a similar thing in terms of the astronomical energy costs that he was facing, the increase around those. The comment that I made back to him was in terms of, he also obviously had issues in terms of business rates, and there was certainly a lot more that we could do to support businesses like him in relation to business rates. But I think, you know, it is unfortunately something that we haven't covered in the Select Committee. I do understand that the OBR have looked at that, and it is something that they have they recognise. I think there are about 169,000 firms that fall within a similar sort of position to the gentleman that we've just heard from. So if I could point you in direction of that analysis from the OBR, I think that would probably be most helpful. I'm sorry, I'm not being very helpful around this one, but it's just not something that we.
That's really useful to know, Debbie. You haven't looked at it yet on your committee. The fact that you're here,
it's not yet. It would not come under our scope.
No, it's hard one to know where exactly. Is that Treasury? I mean, where exactly that should fit.
Treasury or Bays, I'd as I say, Darren Jones.
Yes, indeed. Okay.
Yeah,
well, thank you for stepping in. That's very useful. Response. Thank you very much indeed. Right. We're going back now. So I just wanted to go back to the clerk we have here from the Select Committee. So Philip Dunn has had to step away, will be rejoining us. But the clerk of the committee has kindly offered to step in. So that's Martin Atkins. He's clerk of the Environmental and Audit Committee. Martin, I don't know if you were here for the question that came from Banner, which is you were, okay, so yes. You're ready for that?
Yes. Yes, it was about how Parliament assesses whether government policies are sufficient to meet its net zero commitment on the NHS and making healthcare more sustainable. Now, in the Health and Social Care Act, Parliament put a new net zero duty on NHS England, and it allowed NHS England to issue guidance to trusts and commissioners on how to meet net zero targets. But in passing that legislation, I'm not certain Parliament had a great deal of opportunity to discuss how NHS England might actually be assisted to reach those net zero targets. And I think there was no impact assessment prepared in relation to this new duty. So there's a deficiency there in that government proposes legislation, but the scrutiny available to Parliament as the legislation is going through is not necessarily sufficient to work out whether the resources are in place to actually deliver the policies which are being legislated for. There are a range of options to help members of Parliament to provide information to make that assessment. There are parliamentary questions to ministers, which are passed on to NHS England for reply. We can arrange debates on government spending. And backbenchers can arrange debates on these issues. But the way that answers are going to be delivered, I think, is through the Select Committee system. So if the Health and Social Care Committee were to do an inquiry into how NHS England is going to meet its net zero commitment, particularly in the Health and Social Care Act, that would allow, first of all, NHS England to provide its own evidence, but also for evidence to come in from all other different parts of the healthcare system for members to consider and then to come up with their own assessment.
That's really helpful, Martin. Thank you. That's really, really useful. And I think it shows that there's a real space for more research to be coming into Parliament as well. Thank you very much indeed. Right, we're going now to a question from Robert Forsyth, who is a retired commander in the Royal Navy from Eddington. And that's you now, Robert. Are you ready?
I am, yes. My question is, what evidence is being used to determine the cost of all the elements sustaining our Trident nuclear weapons system budget, which currently exceeds any one of the budgets of the 3 conventional armed forces?
Right. Okay. So kind of cost effectiveness calculation. Carol Monaghan, you're on the Armed Forces Bill. You're looking at the Armed Forces Bill at the moment. Are you still with us from the airport there? Are you able to say something about this?
Hi, Tracy. Thanks for that. Yeah, I'm not in the Armed Forces Bill anymore, and I'm not in the defence team anymore. But I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah, I mean, this is a lot of this is the government's own figures actually that looks at this, and they have to make estimates of the cost of both building the Trident submarines or their replacement, and upkeep of these submarines. So a lot of this actually comes from their own estimates, their own calculations, and includes costing that they have done themselves. I think though the question is probably more a political question. I apologise, there's noise in this lounge. It's probably more a political question, because we know that the numbers are something along the lines of it's about 31 billion just to manufacture the 4 new submarines. In terms of the missiles, it's going to be about another 400 million for to extend the life of the current ones, to replace the warheads, another 4 billion. The ongoing costs are about 142 billion. So these are all figures that have been costed. But the question is, can we really afford it? I mean, when the other areas of the armed forces have been pretty much stripped to the bone. And I think that's where we get into a political, that's where we come into, you know, is it right that we can't afford to build frigates and that the 2 aircraft carriers are wrought with difficulties when we're ploughing all this money into a Trident replacement? That's where we get into political, and that's where politicians like me will use this sort of data and this sort of evidence to then make a political case. So I've kind of given you a hint as to my politics on this one. And I think the SNP's position is quite clear on this, but that's how Parliament is, in order to back up a political point that they make. And can I thank, was it Rob in Banbury for his question?
Thank you. Yeah, and it's really helpful to actually make that distinction, that we don't pretend that something's an evidence question when in fact it's a political question, and there's nothing wrong with politics either. So let's go to question 7. I've got a question coming from Noemi David Roger, who is interested in food security, but that's not your question. Okay, Noemi, you're going to ask us about something completely different to what you're interested in.
Yeah, quite different, but yeah, thank you. So my question is that abortion has been decriminalised in Northern Ireland, but is still criminal in England, Scotland and Wales. And so why is there a difference, even though I would believe the evidence is quite similar between these countries or regions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Diana Johnson, are you with us on the...
I am, yes, hello.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. Is this something that you can answer?
I can comment on it, yes. I mean, I think the key thing to remember is that abortion is one of those issues that's a conscience issue in Parliament. And in fact, the reason why Northern Ireland now is actually more progressive than England and Wales is because it never had the 1967 Abortion Act. So the laws around abortion in Northern Ireland dated right back to 1861. So I'm sort of giving you a bit of a history lesson here. And because of human rights and because it was acknowledged that it was completely unsustainable to carry on with the lack of provision in Northern Ireland, Parliament voted a few years ago to set up a new abortion service in Northern Ireland, which actually is more progressive than what's in England and Wales. And it's really interesting. One of the things I just wanted to comment on was Parliament passes laws, but we're not very good at actually then looking at their implementation and looking at whether many years on they're fit for purpose. So we have the 1967 Act, Abortion Act in England and Wales. And actually what we know is, whilst that was a landmark piece of legislation then, medical science has moved on, societal attitudes have moved on since 67. So there is a piece of work for the whole of the British Parliament to do, looking at whether our laws are fit for purpose and meet the needs of modern society. And the 67 Act, I think, is a very good example that we've got it. Governments don't want to unpick it because it's a moral issue that's difficult for governments. But we have, as you say rightly, changed the law in Northern Ireland. And so we do not have the criminal law at all in abortion in Northern Ireland, whilst we still have it underpinning that 67 Act in England and Wales. So you make a very important point, and it's one that Parliament will have to grapple with, about why, as a United Kingdom, we have the criminal law applying in one part of the United Kingdom, but not in another.
Thank you. That's really helpful exposition. Thank you very much, Anna. I'm going to go to a question I've just seen come in from David Corbett, who's a retired educator in Kettering, because I think Debbie Abrahams MP has to go, and I know you can answer this question, Debbie, so please stay with us. David.
Does Parliament assess the impact of the difference between pensions pre-2016 versus post-2016, i.e. that someone on a pension before 2016 and having contributed for 40 years gets, let alone needs, approximately £30 per week less than someone on a pension after 2016 having contributed for 35 years?
I should have said, clearly that wasn't David asking the question. David's asked if we would read it out for him, and so he can watch your response, Debbie. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, that is within the scope of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, and I think it was in 2016 the last review. Not that I was on the Select Committee at that time. I hasten to add, but it was looked at by that particular committee. And it's something that obviously, if we're thinking about the contributions that have been made by women born in the 1950s and have then had their terms of when they might actually receive their pension changed, so that originally it was they should have had it when they were when they were 60, turned 60, and then there were changes in terms in the state pension age, which meant that they didn't receive it till later on, some as late as 67, but on average by 65. So it is a real issue, and the fairness of it in terms of you've contributed and in some cases are still contributing, and yet people later on really needs to be thinking. I don't think we certainly haven't grappled with it over the last 13 years and come to any reasonable conclusion, but it is certainly, in terms of fairness, it is certainly an issue for not just the Select Committee, but for all political parties. But I would also add that when we're looking at fairness, we also need to recognise intergenerational fairness, and we know that it's not state pension is not paid in the same way as a workplace pension or a private pension. You don't have a pot that you pay into. It is paid by people who are in work. So as you retire, when you receive your state pension, you are receiving it from people that are in work. So there is a whole host of things that need to be considered within that mix. And it's not a particularly easy one to grapple with.
It's not, but you gave a really good outline. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. We're going to go now to Ed Sylvester, who works for a TV operations company in High Wycombe.
Hi. UK population is ageing, and I think we desperately need immigration for the workforce. What evidence causes it to be seen as an economic detriment?
Oh, that's a very good question. Diana Johnson, I know you've got to leave shortly, so I'm going to give that to you as a Home Affairs Committee member.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure you will appreciate there's a real tussle between the economic needs of the United Kingdom, and as a constituency MP, I go around my constituency every weekend, and businesses keep telling me they're desperately short of people in hospitality, in the NHS, at the university. And then you've got that set aside, the current policy direction in the United Kingdom, which seems around immigration, sees it as a negative and sees it very much through the prism of perhaps asylum seekers, and has a negative connotation around it. So what the Home Affairs Select Committee does when we look at immigration, we're looking at, for example, where are the shortages in the economy? Has the Home Office got the right groups on the list for where those shortages are, and what steps are they taking to make it as straightforward as possible for people to come and fill those vacancies in the UK? But in terms of, this is really a political issue for the government about where they want to focus. Do they want to say immigration is a good thing and we should encourage it? or do they see it as a negative? And I think just one final thing, I think most people I talk to want to have a fair system that meets our economic requirements of this country, but is fair in terms of the processes that people have to go through, and finding evidence of that is really quite important in having that informed debate, rather than just seeing what often is on the front of newspapers, which is not evidence-based. It's very kind of emotive, and I think that's a problem when you get into a debate on immigration.
Right, very helpful, thank you. I know there are other comments to be made on this. I've got Ottoline Liza, who is head of UKRI, and that's the funder of research. I know thinking about the science world and the research world this is a key theme. Ottoline.
Yes, thank you. So I think that it's absolutely right that the reason that it is a sort of hot topic politically doesn't so much relate to the formal planned immigration routes. So in the science world, for example, it is indeed really important that there is high quality visa access for researchers and specialist technicians and so on, right across their career paths, because research and innovation is an incredibly international activity, and a huge, there's an awful lot of churn globally of researchers moving around, gaining new skills and talents, moving back, and so on and so forth. And that's really important for the research and innovation process. So we run the Global Talent Visa Scheme for the government, which makes it particularly easy for people with kind of certified research funding from particular international organizations to come to the UK in a managed way. So I think that I would agree with the previous speaker that really we need, as we so often do, a more nuanced national debate about exactly what we're talking about, and then the evidence that goes with the different layers of that debate, rather than a debate that goes, immigration, is it good or is it bad? Because that isn't really going to help us get to the right kind of answer.
Ian Diamond, thank you, Ottoline. Ian Diamond, you're the national statistician. Is it to you that Parliament should turn for that nuance?
I don't think it's to me that necessarily for that nuance. Certainly the Office for National Statistics can provide the data that would enable Parliament to have the debate. And I think it is important to look at some of the occupations that have the highest, if you like, vacancies. And Ottoline rightly, with whom I agree completely, has pointed to research where it's important that we are able to attract the very best talent. And indeed, if we look at something like, well, if we look at all the professional occupations, including doctors and nurses and teachers, then around a third, of those born, of those migrants from Australia, New Zealand, or Oceania are in those occupation groups. And indeed, we would find that almost a half of those specialist medical practitioners, such as oncologists and cardiologists, almost a half were born outside of the UK. So I think it's important to look at particular occupations. And for example, again, 2 in 5 of those working in the food products industry, where we know that there are high vacancies, were born outside the UK. So I agree completely about the debate around a managed policy, and the ONS can provide the evidence to help that debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask quickly the 2 librarians, House of Commons and House of Lords. Patrick Vollmer, I can see you're here. Do you get asked much for data from MPs and peers on this subject? That's all I just want, a very short yes, no. Is this a big subject, immigration numbers? Do you get many questions? Do we have either of you librarians with us?
Yeah, so Grant here. So it is a large number of questions from MPs. We actually have dashboards on our website that try to track this as much as possible with the data that comes out of places like Office for National Statistics. So do have a look at the Commons Library website for more statistics.
Thank you very much. Patrick, presumably it's a similar picture over in the Lords.
Yes, it is. I'm not entirely sure my microphone is working.
It is now. It's perfect.
Good, yes. A lot of, again, we do get asked for this type of data. A lot of our work, if not, well, the vast majority of our work is driven by debates on the floor of the House because our members don't have constituencies, and therefore it is very dependent on what is raised by the government and backbenchers and the opposition. But yes, we do get asked for this type of data.
Thank you very much. Right, we're going now to a question from Nicola Bastable. Nicola Bastable, okay, and that is a question about disabled facilities grant. And then we're also taking Simon Matchett has also come through with a similar kind of question on disabilities assessments. So I'm going to take both of those questions together. Before I do, just asking my team to turn Andrew Gilruth to turn your question about increased wildfires and how we define them green again, so that if we get somebody from the Environmental Audit Committee, or actually if we ask the chair of that committee that question later on if they come back. Okay, Nicola.
Thank you. It was just to ask what evidence was used to determine that the means test for the Disabled Facilities Grant should not take into account the considerable cost of care when they calculated the contribution of the applicant.
Right, thank you. I'm going to take Baroness Armstrong's question, but thank you, Nicola, for that. But I'm going to ask Simon to give your question because it's along similar lines, I believe. Simon Matchett, you are from, I don't know actually where your region is. I can't see it from the question, but tell us, please.
Bangor in Northern Ireland.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's what is measured and monitored to improve disability assessments.
Right, thank you. Baroness Armstrong, you're with us. Are you able to give us some response on these questions and tell us about your committee too?
Well, I was in the House of Commons for a long time and then the House of Lords. I was chairing what was called the Public Services Committee. We were only allowed to do things for a short time in the House of Lords because there's so many of us, they've got to share it around. And I'm now on the committee looking at integration of primary and community healthcare. And that means we do have to have, and we're particularly, like today, we've been looking at health inequalities. And so these issues very much come within the health inequalities framework. We don't get a very good, what we were trying to do was look at things across the board in terms of government, and we find that incredibly difficult to do, to get the government to look at things in more than the departmental silos. And actually both questions really are about how do you actually enable people with disabilities to have a high quality of life. And that isn't just about benefits, it is about other things. But what we try and do is get government, find out the information from people like Ian Diamond and others, but then actually quiz the government and try and hold the government to account. And that is a really challenging thing. I don't have the precise answer to the first question at all. But in terms of the second question, we really just quiz people. We bring people in who've had expertise, who've had lived experience, and we then actually try to build up the body of evidence to, in our report, give reports to the government and then get an answer from the government. It's not an easy process. And I might need to disappear because we're voting on the immigration bill today, which is what you've just been discussing. We've already had 5 votes and we're going to have 3 votes, one after the other in a minute.
Yeah, I know. We've had periodic notes across from Baroness Brown also, who's chairs the Science and Technology Committee in the Lords, warning us in and out as the Lords divide. So thank you. We'll come back to you. We'll try you again, Hilary, if you will come back, please, because there are other questions I can see coming in that I know you would be wonderful at answering. I'm going to actually, just on this question very briefly, Ed Humferson, I want to introduce you. I see you on the call. You're the Director General for Statistics Regulation. These sorts of questions, lots of statistics get banded around. We just had a question about immigration. Now we're having a question about disabilities. Can you just say something about that role that you have in making sure that the numbers that are used in Parliament are adding up, are truthful? A very brief comment from you on that, please.
Yeah, so good evening, everyone. I'm head of an organisation called the Office for Statistics Regulation, and our job is to make sure that statistics and data produced by government serve the public. And we do that by setting standards. They've got to be trustworthy, they've got to be high quality, they've got to be valuable. We also point out where more statistics are needed, where there are gaps. And the other thing we do is if there are concerns about how particular numbers are being used, maybe misused or misquoted or used out of context, we will step in and look to clarify the appropriate interpretation. So we don't like to nurture a big profile. We want the statistics to be the story, but we're happy to step in where necessary. And please do raise concerns with us if you have any.
Thank you very much indeed. I've got a question here from Nottingham, from Victoria Hill, who has asked for it to be read out on her behalf. I can see Lillian Greenwood's here. Lillian, I hope you can answer this because it's your constituency, Nottingham South. She's asked, Victoria Hill, is Parliament able to investigate the impact of caps on how much rent can increase, and how much rent can increase by between contracts in the context of the cost of living crisis?
Hi Tracy, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Well, first of all, thank you to Victoria for her question, and I think it's a really important question. The cost of rent is a massive part of the cost of living increase, and it's impacting on very many of my constituents, some of whom are students like Victoria, but many who aren't. And I think the simple answer to the question is, if the question is, can Parliament investigate the impact of caps, then yes, of course they can. And I think this is seen in the context of the government's renters reform bill, because that's one of the issues that's addressed in it, changing the assured short-hold tenancies and introducing a new process for implementing annual rent increases. And of course, in Parliament, we've got a really important role in interrogating that legislation and seeing whether it does what's needed. So I think there's a number of places of evidence that we should be looking to as we address that bill. So the bill's been introduced into Parliament, but it hasn't yet had its second reading debate, which is where we debate the in principle parts of the bill, and then it will go into the bill committee for detailed scrutiny. So I think there's a number of things that we've already got in the way of evidence. So we've already had lots of references to the House of Commons library that pulls together evidence from a wide range of issues. So of course they're looking at evidence from campaigning organisations like Generation Rent, but also evidence from the kind of producers, if you like, the people like the National Residential Landlords Association. They can also pull together international comparisons, and whilst rental markets might be very different between different countries, potentially it's interesting to look at the evidence of places that have introduced rent controls and whether that had the desired impact, or indeed whether it had some unintended consequences. And obviously sometimes we're able to do international comparisons with other devolved nations, which are perhaps a bit more similar when we're looking at legislation in England, and whether there's something different that the Welsh Assembly is doing, or the Scottish Parliament, or indeed in the Northern Ireland Assembly. The Select Committee, the Levelling Up Housing and Communities, looked at the private rented sector last year rather, off the back of the government white paper on a fairer private rented sector. And so they've looked at issues around how you deal with rent increases in the process, and whether they think the government's suggested method works.
Thank you, Lillian, that's brilliant.
Yeah, and just to say that as part of the bill process, at the start, when the bill goes into a bill committee for detailed scrutiny. You can have evidence sessions at the start of that, and both government and opposition can decide who should be witnesses providing evidence. I hope that's helpful.
Really helpful, and we'll take a note of those reports that you've mentioned too, because we'll share those back to Victoria as well. Thank you, really, really helpful. Before we move on completely from this question, I just want to give a very brief sentence to, if possible, David Halpern. Lillian there made reference to comparing what you might call natural experiments that occur when these different things are rolled out. Is that something that you think, parliamentarians should be looking for a bit more to see whether things are working differently in different areas? Is there a benefit sometimes to not rolling everything out on a national basis all at once?
Yes, Tracy, very strong benefits. I mean, in general, governments across the world, certainly including the UK, have not been very good about actually checking whether things work. And it's a big dilemma because the Saviour Parliament, actually, one of the best ways of figuring this out is to not apply it everywhere, so we would know. On the other hand, we're used to the idea of laws always apply everywhere, so that's sort of quite confusing. So trying to find some kind of natural experiments, variation in dosage, whatever, a really, really powerful feedback loop. And just one final comment on this is, Tracy, you'll know well, but others might not. A few years ago, we did a bit of work with Treasury and Cabinet Office to work out what proportion of new expenditure, let alone legislation, was evaluated, and the answer was less than 1 in 10 have any kind of even rudimentary evaluation. So the problem is we just often kind of we're just blind, frankly, and we should be gathering this evidence all the time to figure out as to whether we should readapt or change laws or indeed regulations or expenditure, and we just don't do enough, period. Thank you.
Very useful. I'm going now to Adrian Cole, who's a business analyst from Reading.
Hello. Has Parliament looked into the rapid progress in ageing research and longevity treatments which tackle the underlying causes of age-related diseases?
Right, the underlying cause of age-related diseases. I don't know, do we have Baroness Brown back from voting? Please, would someone let me know as soon as we do. I can go, Carol Monaghan, are you looking at ageing on your committee? Are you still with us? No, Carol may have taken
Yes, I'm still here, Tracy. No, it's not one of the things we're looking at just now, but I would also say that there are other groups within Parliament. Committees are one of the groups that can consider these things, but there are also things like that are known as all-party parliamentary groups, and these groups cover all different types of topics. Sometimes it's difficult for select committees to cover everything they would like to, but there are these other groups that will look at these kind of things. And there's one of the groups that I sit on is the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee. And we've looked at ageing in a number of ways. We've looked at nutrition for ageing. We've looked at exercise for healthy ageing, and how the environment can actually have an impact on health in older age groups. So we have looked at a lot of these things, and these meetings are open to any parliamentarians, both in the Commons or the Lords. So they are another way in which parliamentarians can gain evidence and gain information about different topics like this. So I don't know, I don't know if there's anyone from the Health Committee or if they're away, but maybe that's something they're considering.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try and take some rapid comments from a number of people on this, just to sort of say, Adrian's question is Parliament is Parliament aware of this rapid progress and looking at it? And so I'm going to, Baroness Brown, are you with us from the SciTech on the other side?
Yes, I'm Baroness Brown. I chair the Science and Technology Select Committee in the House of Lords, and it's not an area that we have looked at recently on the House of Lords Science and Technology Select Committee. It is the type of thing we might look at, but just another area where parliamentarians get a lot of useful information on things like this is the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology Post, who produce post notes to brief parliamentarians of both houses, and also have post fellows who are researchers from academia who come in to learn about how research influences policy. And I can't entirely remember what all the post notes we've had recently have been, but I think we may have had one on some aspect of ageing, and it would be well worthwhile looking at the post website to see some of the briefings they've produced as well.
Fantastic. We're getting to hear about a lot of other work that's going on in Parliament now. That's quite a big range between what you and what Karen Monaghan has also outlined. So there are a lot of ways in which people are taking notice of new trends. I'm going to very briefly give a comment to Ottoline Liza and Ian Diamond on the numbers and the research around this too. Ottoline.
Well, just to say that obviously UK Research and Innovation funds a huge amount of research on this topic, ranging quite across a wide range of disciplines on how you support healthy lifestyles overall to help people live longer and in a more healthy state, but also on some of the kind of senolytic interventions and so on, which are coming up fast on the more kind of classical pharmaceutical side of things. And all of this feeds into evidence that we provide to Parliament in a whole variety of contexts, be that through select committees, as you described, or there are a lot of embedded policy fellowships now as well, which are, I think, very valuable in providing evidence for policymakers into Parliament.
And indeed through Evidence Week, because there is a briefing on healthy ageing next tomorrow or Wednesday, I think it's Wednesday. There's a briefing on healthy ageing. Someone's going to stick that in the chat for the questionnaire, Adrian, and let you know more about that. Ian, did you want to make a short comment on this? National statistician. No, we don't have Ian with us at the moment. We're going to go straight to Ramesh Gupta, who has a question about something completely different, and we've just had a response in from your MP.
Good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. My question relates to the Scottish legal system, which is subtly but significantly different to that in England. The question is, what role does Parliament have in ensuring that the judicial process in Scotland is robust and just? If Parliament does indeed have a role, how does Parliament manage those cases where an individual has documentary evidence that he or she has been badly failed, not only by the Sheriff Court, but by the appeal process and the various institutions that exist or purport to help such individual whose lives have consequently been blighted or indeed destroyed?
Okay, we have a comment, I think, it's come in from Angela Crawley, who's Lanarkshire.
Yes, the response is the UK Parliament would not evaluate decisions by Scottish courts. Sheriff courts are the primary criminal and civil courts in Scotland. They are operated by the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, which is an independent body created by the Scottish Parliament. Justice is a devolved matter for the Scottish Government. If Ramesh has an issue with a decision made by Sheriff Court, he should raise this with his MSP. Alternatively, he can raise it directly through the official complaints procedure, and we have contact details of that and a fuller response from Angela Crawley as well to send on.
Thank you very much. We'll do that. Pippa Morgan is a trainee teacher, I think from East Lothian. And Carol, can you stay on for this? Because obviously you were a teacher in not far away from Pippa.
Hi there, thank you. My question is, what has been the impact on learning in literacy, maths and science education during the pandemic?
Wow, big question. Okay, we got a short answer.
I don't think so. It's obviously quite complex, and it's interesting because it very much depends on the demographic. We know that the impact on learning has been much more severe for those who are coming from a more disadvantaged background, or those where parents possibly are working full time. That's been much more tricky. Whereas if the young person's from a more supportive but from probably a more affluent background, there have been the interventions from parents have been have had more impact than those for disadvantaged children. So there is a real serious issue here. The other issue I would say, I mean, you ask about STEM learning. The big thing that sets STEM aside from other aspects of the curriculum is the practical work. And you've got situations where young people have not been exposed, and this is both in school and in college and university settings, but they've not been exposed to the practical work that they would have had pre-pandemic. So you've got young people that don't have all the skills they should have. Now, this in subjects like, for example, physics, that is really going to have an impact But also if you're looking at things like medicine and dentistry students who are not able to get hands-on experience, that's really is going to have a big impact on everybody. So I think we're going to be living with the impacts of COVID on a number of young people and their learning for many years to come. And there's going to have to be continued intervention to try and help us get them back to where they should have been.
Brilliant, thank you. Ottilie, on research going on this, a lot of research starting to grow up on this whole question of the impact of pandemic measures on education.
Absolutely. I mean, clearly it's going to take a while to be sure what those impacts were. And I posted in the chat a relatively small study that we're funding on exactly that, particularly in the context of inequalities, as was mentioned. And of course, there's also a lot of opportunity for interventions in the education system to support catch-up activities, and the better the evidence you have for exactly what's needed, the more effective and targeted those can be. I think we might get later to AI questions, and there's a lot of interest in EdTech interventions, how you can use AI to tailor learning dynamically for particular students, for example.
Well, stay live, Ottilie, because we actually can go to Olivia Stevens, who has got a question. I think she's got a friend asking on her behalf.
Yeah, hi. Thanks. Yeah, the question Olivia wanted to ask was about AI being used by statutory bodies like the police and the DWP, and essentially asking what evidence Parliament is using to make sure the outcomes from using those systems are fair and are not discriminatory.
Okay, Ottilie, I don't think that's the fairness bit of that is perhaps not quite your bag, but is there evidence about following the outcomes of these different interventions? Is there work going on to, is research keeping pace with the way that policy is acting in this area?
So this is actually, I mean, it's a very live issue, as AI is obviously an incredibly, it's a whole suite of technologies really that can be used in an enormous range of different situations. And it is a very good thing, I think, that a lot of these considerations have been raised very early in the day. And so there is a situation where we have embedded really quite a lot of thinking about the safety, the ethics, and so on of AI as things are rolled out. So, for example, we've very recently funded a substantial consortium in the UK to create an ecosystem for responsible and trustworthy AI, which will be working exactly in these kinds of contexts. And there are, I would say, two critical issues for the kind of machine learning types of AI that are quite often at the center of these kinds of interventions. And one of them is the quality and the integrity of the data set on which you train them in the first place. And that, if Ian Diamond is still with us, can maybe talk about how the public sector data records might be used to build really high quality versions of those things that wouldn't have some of the biases that if you start with a more low quality data set. So that's one element. And then the other is a critical issue of so-called explainability. So different AI algorithms are differently kind of transparent in how they've made the decisions. And there are very interesting regulatory options for developing regulation that makes sure that the level of explainability is appropriate for the application in question. So if it's something like a big kind of decision that's going to affect someone's life in a big way, then explainability would seem to be very important. But if it's your Amazon thing suggesting what book you should buy, then maybe you don't care so much to understand exactly how it's made the decision of the recommendation that it's giving you.
Thank you. Ed Humferson, you had your hand raised.
Just to build on all the excellent points that Ottilie's just made, the one thing that we as an Office for Statistics Regulation would always advocate is a very high degree of transparency as well, relates to the explainability point. But the work that we've done, particularly around the exam algorithms, remember the algorithms which we used to set A-level and GCSE grades in 2020, is that a degree of transparency about what's being done and a very high degree of public engagement to confer a social license. That's an essential feature of public sector use of these technologies. Thank you.
Thank you. I've actually got a question. Just stay with us here, Ed. I've got another question from Chantal Warren-Jones, who's in Barham. She's got family issues that have pulled her away. And she's asked, how is Parliament ensuring the government's use of AI and whether it values and amplifies quality of life, not just economically? Can you give us an indication of where to unpick that question? I mean, values and amplifies quality of life, not just economically. Are these things that are reasonable to, are these questions that are reasonable for Parliament to be putting?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of these questions, I mean, I'd love to give answers which were statistical, because that's my core terrain, is statistics and data. But a lot of these questions are questions of what we value as society and how we form judgments about what's fair. And that's really the proper place for Parliament to debate and explore those questions. The point about transparency is you can't have those debates unless it's clear what data are being used, in what way, to achieve what. Once you've got that, then I think you can have the appropriate parliamentary debates. And Parliament, I think, is very, very engaged with these questions. Indeed, yeah.
Well, yeah, actually, as you say that, I can see Chantal's MP is Rosie Duffield from Canterbury, who's also sent in a comment in the first few lines. I don't know if a colleague wants to share this, the first few lines of that comment, because it says exactly that.
Yeah, Tracy, the response was just last Thursday. The House of Commons considered artificial intelligence. I believe we need to be ambitious for technologies such as AI, and I want to see them embedded in our everyday services, whether to speed up welfare claims or diagnose patients in hospitals. But this must be done responsibly and in partnership with businesses to face the future and address the challenges, opportunities and risks head on. Above all, it is crucial that innovation does not come at the expense of everyday working people. And there is a fuller response as well.
We'll send that on. Okay, that's brilliant. Ricky Nathvani, who is from London and struggling with a lack of housing. Now, I don't know if Baroness Armstrong's come back to us yet, but hopefully will. And if not, I'll put your question again a bit later. Do you want to ask your question, Ricky?
Sure, thank you, Tracy. So my question is, what actual evidence is being used to determine housing affordability policies and building targets?
Okay, what evidence is being used? Can I grant House of Commons Library, a lot of MPs are really interested in this question. Are you providing them with information about it?
We are, and there's actually a whole section on our website that I'll put in the chat in a minute that has lots and lots of briefings on housing policy. So just thinking about the stats, so there was a very large report with statistics published in May by the House of Commons Library, which you can Google. It's called Tackling the Undersupply of Housing in England, or I'll put in the chat in a minute. The biggest difficulty for us, and it's probably the same for Office for National Statistics, is actual estimates for housing need are quite difficult. There's a number of charities that have worked out it's probably about 340,000 new homes each year. 145,000, so almost half of those will need to be affordable housing within the current definition of that. So that's 340,000 each year. Supply reached 243,000 per year in 2019-2020 time, but decreased since then. Obviously, COVID had a big impact, and we haven't really had a big peak in housing supply since about the 1960s. But that was because there used to be lots more demolition and rebuilding of houses back in the 60s and 70s. So actually our net supply in 2021 is actually higher than the 1970s. So in some ways it's going in the right direction. But the paper I reference has a lot on the barriers and possible solutions for housing. So thinking about public sector investment that might be needed, how we can actually make sure land is available for building use, resource and local authority planning departments. There's a real bottleneck there in actually approving planning applications, funding all the essential infrastructure that needs to be put in place, so the roads, the utilities, etc. encouraging more small and medium-sized building firms into the market to help meet the needs, and also make sure that the training for the construction industry is meeting all of our needs. So the other thing I'll link to is there is an interactive tool that shows housing supply by local authority that we've put together. So I'll put all those in the chat for you, Ricky.
Well, Ricky, did you ever imagine the House of Commons was that well informed on the subject? That is a huge amount of information. Thank you very much indeed. There's a lot of information coming through in the chat now, which we can also share. I'm going very quickly to Joe Wolf, who is from Dulwich, master's student in Dulwich, and he wants to ask about vaping. He or she, I don't know. Joe.
Yeah. Hi everyone.
Yes.
So my research among 18 to 24-year-olds shows recreational vaping, which is basically vaping without previously smoking, is very common and potentially a huge problem for their health. But the government's new regulation only focuses on stopping children vaping and helping smokers quit. So would Parliament look at new evidence on this and consider broadening the focus of the bill?
Okay, right. I can see that we've got Liz Twist on this call. Liz, are you willing to say something on this? And I think we'll go to David Halpin too. Liz Twist, MP.
Yes,
you're with us. Hi.
On this. As one of the MPs who took part in the smoking reduction debate just a couple of weeks ago, this is one of the areas we've been focusing on. So there is, as you said, a huge amount of concern about the impact of vaping on young people and whether vaping turns people who don't smoke into smokers. So I'd be really interested in your research as well to hear what you've been finding out on this issue. So currently the emphasis, as you know, has been on making sure that vaping is available to adults, because it's much better for people who smoke to vape than not to smoke. But we've got this kind of proliferation of sweetie flavoured and disposable vapes. So, there's the environmental issues arising from that. And also,
let's stay there a second. Just hold on tight for a minute. I've got another question on exactly the same issue, right? Slightly different. So before you finish your comment and before I go to David, Robert Galloway from Hove. Can someone actually read this question for him? I think he's actually on
Of
call.
course, yeah.
An consultant, so I'm not surprised.
Yeah, Rob is in hospital at the moment, so I'll ask the question on his behalf. Vaping has now become popular in people who have never smoked cigarettes. Is Parliament investigating whether vaping has long-term health effects?
Okay, so this is a slightly different question as well about the long term. So if you could wrap that into your response, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, okay. So as you were saying, we've been looking in particular about stopping people who've never smoked, young people who've never smoked, starting them on a path. We don't know what the outcome will be. There is a need for research. The government has said that there's a call for evidence, I believe, and we'll be looking at this issue. But I think those was on the all-party parliamentary group for tobacco. I forget the exact title, but it's to Stop Smoking APPG in shorthand. Will be wanting the government, and will be conducting their own research as well through organisations like ASH and others, Fresh in the Northeast, to see what the impact is. So I think the message from us was we want vapes available for adults who smoke, to stop them smoking and help to quit, but we need to see much more action on vaping for people who are not currently smokers, and that includes very young people, but as you say, that slightly older group as well. And I'd be really interested to hear your research on this.
Look at that, Joe. You've actually got a direct line into Parliament. It just shows you how open MPs are to hearing about new research at the cutting edge, which is a really good message. David Halpin, do you have a comment on this? It's a behavioural issue.
Oh yes, well you may be aware when I was in Downing Street with Cameron, it was an issue which we pushed for, which is make e-cigarettes available. Of course, we slid backwards on two fronts, which bears on these issues. So there was an expectation, let's face it, I think the evidence is pretty good that if you're a smoker, you're much better off to vape and step away if that makes it easier. It's 60% more effective than using nicotine replacement, etc. So it's 60% more effective. On the other hand, the intention wasn't to encourage loads of people to start vaping. I think it'd be interesting, of course, to see your research. One problem we got is that if young people are vaping, it's quite a few years before we'll really know what the health impacts are. But it would obviously be better not to vape. There's certainly some telltales that are a worry in there. About, as you probably know, even by the time you get to 18-year-olds, a third have tried vaping, which is interesting since it's supposed to be illegal. Although bizarrely, because it's not illegal to give away e-cigarettes, but it is illegal to sell them to youth. So that's certainly a telltale concern. So it's something which I know is increasing interest around. As it happens, our view is also the evidence is it's going the wrong way elsewhere, which is that on the one hand, it's easier to get to vape in lots of ways with unknown, issues. But bizarrely, there's still no prescription grade e-cigarette available in the UK, which for existing populations, not least with mental health issues and older adults, there's not that route. So it does look a little bit peculiar. And we don't have to wait, I think, 20 years to know what the long-term effects are. It does look like we're out of step with respect to some of the control issues with younger people in particular, which is great to see your evidence. But also, let's not forget, we've now just give you one last statistic, which I think is worrying. In 2023, the first time the lines crossed, where there are more people in Britain who think vaping is as bad or worse than smoking.
Yeah.
And I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming on that, which is it really is not. And so it's really worrying that that perception has come through about the evidence and a real concern.
So asking important questions, Parliament's got to be asking important questions, but not imagining that this is the next smoking in doing so. But we must still be asking questions, of course.
Yeah, I think if I can just say, I think there is that need for evidence to show the long-term effect, and we don't want to see that there are really negative effects long-term and find lots of people have been damaged by something we don't know. So it's something we need to look at. But it is vitally important to make sure that smokers are able to use them to quit. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Very helpful response. I'm going to Callum Sumpter now, who's from London. Callum, you have a question about plastic.
Yeah, absolutely. So my question is about plastic waste. I know that Parliament called to ban exporting plastic waste by 2027, but last year still 500,000 tons was exported to foreign countries. Just wondering what assessments are made to ensure these countries are capable of handling this waste and whether our government or foreign governments can be held accountable for the environmental and health impacts of poor waste management.
Fantastic. I'm going to actually add another question that has come in from Mike Watts, which is what evidence is used in policy behind reductions of plastic pollution. So another question actually really underlining what you're interested in here. I think Philip Dunn's actually with us from the Environmental Audit Committee.
Hello, Tracy. Yes, I've just joined you, so I heard the question and apologies for only just getting to you. I've been in a debate in the House. So I chair the Environmental Audit Committee, as you said, and we have done quite a lot of work on plastics and reducing plastic waste, but primarily around individual items of waste rather than looking at it in the whole, in the aggregate, which I think was the question which came in first on this. I know that the EFRA Select Committee, so the Select Committee that shadows the department, produced a report last November on plastic waste, looking at some of the problems in the way it's exported and what happens to it when it gets to other countries which are supposed to be handling it properly and all too often don't, which is clearly very regrettable. And that there was a suggestion that it be possible to process waste onshore, and recommended that the government should establish a ban on exporting waste to encourage onshore processing. I think, well, the government rejected that suggestion. I think one of the problems is the costs of reprocessing. You need a very significant volume to make it make sense, and much reprocessing and in particular sorting has historically been done by hand, which is clearly very expensive and unpleasant. And until the technologies allow the sorting, which are improving all the time, it's so that may well become possible, but it's, I think, been quite tricky. In terms of the evidence used behind reductions, our committee has done a lot of work on water quality, and a couple of years ago we had a professor from Manchester University who's a leading expert on microplastics in water come and actually give us a physical demonstration standing outside in a stream of a small riverbed outside of an outfall pipe from a wastewater treatment works, and he calculated by putting a drum, a big drum which was opened at both ends into the water, and then lifting out the sediment that was underneath it and counting the microplastic particles that were in it. And it was quite shocking how much plastic is still coming through our drainage systems even after treatment.
Wow. Philip, I've got a lot of questions that are coming in for you. That was a brilliant response. I think there's more that we can share on plastics from your committee's work. Can I throw a few more at you, because we're in the last 5 minutes and I'm anxious to have you on key things. First of all, very quick yes or no answer. Will you support Andrew Gilruth's proposal that there should be a single definition of wildfires? That this is causing confusion in discussions. That was a question that came in, a proposal that Parliament needs a definition of wildfires.
I'm not aware of that, so I can't give you a yes or no.
We'll share that question with you in more detail at a later stage. We have another question from Henrietta Walker, who also I think want to direct this one at you. Henrietta, are you ready, from Hackney?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, hi. When considering the government's proposals on road planning, does Parliament assess the impact of air quality, noise pollution and health when considering road planning?
Okay, I'm going to take, before I take Philip back on that question, I'm also, I've got another question a bit further on, I'm just looking for, Deborah Westlake. I think it'd be useful if you threw your question in and we'll get Philip to go a brief answer to both.
Okay, so I ask now?
Yeah.
Okay. How does Parliament assess whether government policy on and incentives to farmers will address the loss of 97% of our meadows? And the importance of meadows obviously is that they're species rich, they have wildflowers and grasses rather than just a monocrop of grass.
Okay, so both of those are questions, Philip, about how Parliament assesses these impacts.
Okay, so I mean, both of them have something to do with different aspects of the Environment Act, which was brought into effect in autumn 21 as a direct result of Brexit. One to do with air quality, and the other primarily, and the other to do with soil quality. And as Parliament has a direct relationship for now for the latter, for looking at land use and the way in which we meet these targets under this environment, under the Environment Act. But in relation to road building is primarily a planning function. Obviously, the funding comes from the Department for Transport, which is subject to scrutiny by Parliament. But and planning, depending on how large the new road is either subject to direct legislation from Parliament, but more often is effectively determined by local authorities. So if it's a national scale road, so if it's a new motorway or an extension of a motorway, that may be subject to, may require a bill. Like, for example, we have the new railway line, HS2. Each section of that goes through a specific parliamentary legislation which gets down to all these issues about impact on environment, the road, some of our major roads, which have been built during my lifetime, have curious swerves in them, which have come about as a result of pressure through the parliamentary process when they were first built. Railways. But roads, no. We are, as a committee, I'm sorry, I know you want to be much quicker in my answers, Tracy, so I'm sorry about this. We as a committee are looking at air quality right now. We just announced an inquiry into it. We started taking hearings about it. And I think there will be growing responsibility on government and Parliament to take these things into account.
Okay, we're going to just go a couple of minutes over, if I can ask everyone to bear with us, because I do want to include some more questions. Richard Wisnan, who's a retired railway engineer.
Thank you. My question is, what do our
current climate prediction models look like? Can they predict when and where mass migration is most likely to occur, and which parts of currently heavily populated countries are at greatest risk of becoming uninhabitable?
Wow, okay. That was quite a question to finish on. We have a comment from your MP, Kevin Hollingray, so I'm going to send that on to you. He's replied from Thurston Moulton. So Albert Klein-Tank, can I give you 20 seconds on this? Are you with us still?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. It's an excellent question. I can make part of an answer. So the Met Office advice into government really focuses on two aspects of climate change. How can we avoid the worst impacts by limiting the global warming? But the other one, and your question refers to that, what are the changes in climate and extreme weather that we need to adapt to? And for that, we particularly use climate predictions models, computer models, which are global in nature, so both covering land and ocean. And really focusing, a key concern is where are the hotspots of climate change? So very high temperatures, lack of water. And these areas, we can really pinpoint where these areas are in future. And usually these areas are also which were now already vulnerable, where societies are vulnerable for climate change in particular.
Thank you, Richard. If you need a link to any of this that we can actually follow that up with you, please just email us again. We'll put you in touch with what Albert can provide. And just finally, we did have a question from a junior doctor who's asking about NHS patient satisfaction surveys. And I just want to know whether NHS patient satisfaction surveys are used in Parliament or in government at all. Ed Humphrey, do you know anything about this? 10 seconds.
There are a lot of patient satisfaction surveys. There's name satisfaction survey. There's GP satisfaction surveys. There's the Care Quality Commission surveys of cancer and community mental health and adult inpatients. There's a wealth of information, and it all feeds into giving an overall picture to accompany the statistics which measure NHS performance, like waiting times, ambulance response times, and so on. So I think there's no shortage of information which gives a really kind of quite real-time picture of performance, but also how people experience the NHS. And I suppose the challenge is what policymakers then do with that information. But it's a very, very rich, well-measured terrain.
Yeah, I think the question is really, were they for therapeutic benefit, or is Parliament actually looking at them? Or is anyone actually looking at them? Yeah. Was there a final point?
I was just going to say, as a former health minister, I can assure you that patient participation surveys are used as one of the primary evidence sources for how the NHS is doing. I mean, historically, we had a very high approval rating compared to other countries on this issue. And of course, it's been going down really since the pandemic.
Right. There you go, folks. It's really important to fill those out. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely amazing. We've had far more questions than we can fit in, and we will come back to everybody who sent stuff in and who didn't get a chance to ask their question today. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you for staying with us and for ducking in and out between votes in the Lords and the Commons. Patrick Vollmer and Grant Hill-Cawthorne, the librarians, I know have been sharing information. I'm sorry not to have come to them more because they are a fantastic source in both houses. So thank you for joining us and being willing to answer a little bit, even though we didn't make use of your expertise by any stretch. Thank you also to the MPs who I know you're very busy and you're trying to fly back from constituencies or train back from constituencies as well today, many of you, as well as take part in votes and things. So really, really appreciate that time. I'm going to give just a very brief word of thank you and goodbye to Chris Sims from the University of Nottingham. He's going to tell us a little bit about what's coming up over coming days. Chris.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Everyone, I won't keep you for too long. I'm sure you've all got dinners to get to and families to get to and tennis to watch possibly. But I did just want to say thank you all so much for what was a really stimulating and interesting and informative discussion, which I think will really have set the tone for what I hope will be a really, really productive Evidence Week. We're delighted at the University of Nottingham to be supporting Evidence Week this year. We're obviously a university that's very committed to improving those connections between evidence and policy making, and that's why it's so great to see such a great turnout to this event and see that commitment comes from your side as well. Really, really delighted to see that. Over the next week, UK universities from across the country are going to be participating, are going to be bringing their evidence and their research direct to you, to the policymakers, for you to engage with. Obviously, the sector represents a vast resource of evidence for policy, which we don't always make as much use of as we can, and we are certainly committed to improving that, but that's not going to happen without collaboration between us, between yourselves as policymakers, and between those organisations that can play that intermediary role. So particularly grateful to Sense About Science for everything that you're doing and for organising what I think is going to be a fantastic week. I don't want to keep you all, so I'm just going to say open invitation to all of you to stop by our pod on the Wednesday of Evidence Week. We have our professors Sarah Hall and John Gathergood. They're going to be talking about their work from the schools of economics and geography here around Track the Economy, which is a new tool which enables you to get unique real-time data insights down to the constituency level. So maybe of particular interest to those of you from the Commons. I will be there as well. I won't have so much interesting stuff to say. The real know-it-alls are the academics who'll be with me, but I hope I'll get the chance to meet some of you and to really find out how we can work together to improve evidence-based policy making. Thank you all very much again. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Real-time economic data is the holy grail of every MP. So please come along to those briefings over the next couple of days. Thank you all again. And especially to our constituents who many of you I know are not accomplished public speakers. We applaud you for turning up and for asking your questions and bringing them to the door of the people who decide, really do. Thank you all this evening for taking part. Bye-bye.